درود چطورگانید؟ شما نمیدونید چی شد ولی من میدونم چی شد. آره بریم. آقا یک ویدیو آوردم براتون، ویدیو بسیار خوبیه. اینجا What tattoos do to the skin. تتوها با پوست چی کار میکنن؟ از Institute of Human Anatomy، مؤسسه آناتومی بدن انسان. Like and subscribe if you like the content here. Obviously they're very popular. 6.67 million subscribers. I mean, they're doing a very good job. Okay. بعد دیگه لایک کنید، سابسکرایب کنید اگه دوست داشتید ویدیو رو. یه دو تا ویدیو دیگه هم هست اینجا، یکی اینجا اتانول یا همون مشروب. شما که اتانول رو همینجوری که نمیخورید دیگه، خب در حکم مشروب میخورید. با بدن چی کار میکنه؟ یکی هم همون سیگار الکتریک ویپ باهاتون چی کار میکنه، با بدنتون چی کار میکنن، که این دوتا من خیلی مشتاقم بدونم. باز در موردش یه دونه ویدیو ساختیم در مورد این یکی که اینجاست، اگه ندیدید برید ببینید. احتمالاً یه چیزی لینکی این ور اون ور بالا پایین یه جایی میادش. خب بعد دیگه چی؟ دیگه همین چند وقت پیش داشتم با یکی از دوستام در مورد ضررهای تتو صحبت میکردم. خب من تتو ندارم، اونا تتو دارن. بعد اونا خیلی معتقد بودن که ضرر خاصی نداره و حالا یکم بیشتر در مورد یک سری طرح‌هایی که رو تتو میزنن رو بدن آدم صحبت کردیم که 100% آدم‌ها آزادن هر کاری دوست دارن بکنن، هر کسی به خودش مربوطه. ولی خب یه سری طرح‌ها هست که به نظرم خیلی مثلا خوب نیست و اینا. در مورد اونها هم صحبت کردیم که اون خیلی مطرح نیست اینجا، مورد بحث ما نیست. بریم ببینیم. زیرنویس هم داریم، منم رو زیرنویس نیستم احتمالاً، اما برای اینکه دیگه 100% نباشیم رو زیرنویس میریم بالا. بریم. چی؟ از هر 3 نفر یه نفر تتو داره؟ واو. نسل‌های جوانتر رو فقط اگه در نظر بگیری 40% مردم تتو دارن. هولی، نزدیک به نصف. هولی، نسل‌های جوانتر نصف مردم تتو دارن. چرا من اینقدر تاریکم؟ پرگارم. یکم از اینا بدیم بهش. بریم. خب حاجی خیلی انا یو هو. بذار من الان دوستامو نگاه کنم. مثلا من 6 تا دوست دارم، 3 تاشون تتو دارن. راست میگه، راست میگه. پرگارام. بریم.
40% if you just take into consideration the younger generations. So I think it's important that we use real human skin to go over the anatomy of tattoos, or in other words, how tattoos work. Like, what layer does the ink specifically go into? And why doesn't our body try to get rid of the ink because it's technically a foreign substance? Also, what do we mean by...
خب منظورش اینه که خب شما هر چیزی ماده خارجی که وارد بدنتون میشه، بدنتون با این به عنوان یک عامل خارجی، به عنوان اجنبی باش برخورد میکنه، میزنه، یعنی سعی میکنه که به چخ بده قضیه رو. خب واضحه این برای هر کسی که این کار بدنتون میکنه. اما یه سری چیزا خب مثل این، مثلا شما حتی اگه برید پیوند عضو بگیرید، بدنتون با اون عضوی که پیوند شده بهتون مثل چیز خارجی برخورد میکنه. اوکی، در این حد. حالا میگه که چرا باهاش برخورد نمیکنه؟ چیه قضیه؟
Tattoos are permanent because certain things can cause tattoos to fade with time. Obviously, we have some questions to answer, so let's do this.
تبلیغات که
So if we're going to
نداریم.
talk about how tattoos work, we definitely need to have a basic understanding of the skin. The skin belongs to a system called the integumentary system, or just
integumentary system. یا فقط اینتگومنت؟ بذار ببینیم توضیح میده یا باید گوگل کنیم.
The integument. It's comprised of three main layers from top to bottom or superficial to deep, starting with the epidermis, then the dermis.
اوضاعی دارم اوضاع کاملا در اوضاع به سر میبرم. اپیدرم،
And then the
درم،
hypodermis, also
هایپودرم. اپیدرم روی پوسته، درم اینجای گوشتیه است، هایپودرم میشه اینجایی که بادکنکای میگن بادکنکای زردی هست
known as the
که چربیه.
subcutaneous
من
layer.
مسخره باز در میارم میم میکنم، فکر نکنید من احمقم. اوکی، من احمق نیستم، به نظر شبیه احمقا میام ولی اشتباه نکن.
We are definitely going to take a look at all three of these layers on real human skin, but I have to mention something important about these layers as it pertains to tattooing and ink deposition. Each one of these layers, the epidermis, dermis, and hypodermis, is made out of a completely different tissue when you compare it to the other.
یعنی از یک بافت دیگن. آره، هر کدومشون سه تا بافت مختلفن، یعنی یه بافت نیستن.
In other words, the epidermis is made out of a totally different tissue than the dermis, and the dermis is made out of a totally different tissue than the hypodermis.
خب
Why is that important?
خب
Because the nature of the tissue will definitely influence how ink is deposited in that layer, how permanent the ink is in that layer.
اوکی، یعنی اون جوهر چجوری ذخیره میشه تو اون بافت. اوکی، 100% تاثیر داره.
And
بله.
even just how the tattoo works. Or in other words, it influences how the ink is going to behave in each individual layer. So let's start with that epidermis. So here we've got two skin grafts here.
اینجا
Let's start with this one. And this outer layer here is the actual epidermis. I always find it interesting when we bring the aesthetic students in here. They always know.
خب اون یارو سیستم رو توضیح نداد ها. اینتگومنت سیستم معنی اینتگومنت پوشش طبیعی بدن. integumentary system. آها، اکولوژی نه. آره شایدم. بذار به رشته پزشکی است. مرسی که مربوط به رشته پزشکی است. integumentary system. کو integumentary system. یک مورد یافت شد. دستگاه پوششی بدن. اوکی.
Notice the freckles and the sun damage here. But this epidermis, if I show you the cut edge, is just that top paper thin layer there. The majority of the tissue that you see here
هرچی هم زوم میکنه نمیشه.
is the dermal tissue. Just that top paper thin edge is the epidermis, which is pretty remarkable because it can be up
اون کل پوست بود، روش فقط اون اپیدرم.
to 50 cell layers thick. And the epidermis is your protective layer, and it's made out of a tissue called epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is a highly cellular tissue, and what I mean by that is that the cells are just packed together and stacked on top of each other, like I mentioned earlier, can be up to 50 cell layers thick and sometimes more. But to the naked eye, that's only about 0.1 millimeters, so relatively thin from our perspective. But what happens is these cells that are at the bottom of the epidermis, or this epithelial tissue that makes up the epidermis, they copy themselves. And so when one cell copies itself, one of the copies goes on top. Guess what happens next? It makes another copy, and the cell that was right here gets pushed up, and the new copy comes underneath it. And that continues to happen, and cells move upward. As the cells move upward closer to the surface, they start to flatten out and die because they get pushed further from the blood supply. And we don't care about that. because those dead flat cells give us a nice protective barrier from friction and abrasion. That's what I'm doing here, not itching my skin here, but protects us from that friction and abrasion. And that process just continues on every single day. Now, as the cells move up, eventually they're going to get to the very top and flake off. You can shed over 1
اوکی بریم خب
million cells per day.
چی؟
You can think that's disgusting, but it's anatomy, so it technically is under the classification of being awesome. Now,
خب چی شد؟ ببین اوکی یه سری سلولن اون بافت رویه همینجوری همدیگه رو کپی میکنن از همدیگه میسازن میره بالا اینا هول داده میشن میره بالا بعد که میرن بالا میمیرن دد میشن دد که میشن اون سطح سلول مرده روی پوست بعد دیگه خیلی دیگه داغون که میشن پوست میشن میرن از اون زیر خب اینا رو فهمیدیم اوکی
kind of think about that with how that influences tattoo and ink deposition. This wouldn't be a great layer to tattoo or put ink into, but the reality is some of the ink, as it is being injected into the skin, does get deposited into this layer and therefore some of the cells.
خب
But as you know, because those cells are moving upward, eventually any ink that's in there is going to flake off. It takes around 4 weeks or so for a cell to get from the bottom to the top. So any of the ink that does get deposited in there, you can see it's pretty much scattered throughout your house as dust. So the next layer down is extremely important to tattooing and ink deposition. And as we mentioned earlier, this was called the dermis. So let's take a look again at the cadaver
این
dissection.
اون وسطی گوشتیوه
The majority of this cut edge here was the dermis or the dermal tissue where that paper thin top was the epidermis. The epidermis, again, made of epithelial tissue, but the dermis or this dermal tissue is made out of a totally different tissue.
اسم بافت اون گفتم که بافتای مختلف اسم بافت رویه که اپیدرم بود که الان توضیح دادیم اون اپیتیلیال بود اپیتلیال اوکی
But the dermis or this dermal tissue is made out of a totally different tissue called dense irregular connective tissue. And it's the nature of this dense irregular
بافت پیوندی نامنظم متراکم چقدر اسم بلندی داره بافت پیوندی نامنظم متراکم
connective tissue that allows ink to be deposited and for it to last many, many years, or what we would think of as permanent. And so for us to more fully appreciate how the ink can be permanent or relatively permanent in this layer, we're going to zoom in to this cut edge of the dermis here, like on a little magic school bus ride, by zooming in to the model here. So this would be that same cut edge here, and to orient you, this would be the epidermal layer here, or the epidermis. From my thumb to my pointer down here would be the dermis. Now, very different tissues, the epidermis and the dermis. Remember, this had tons of cells packed together, the epidermis, but the dermis, we wouldn't see that. We'd see only a few cells scattered throughout the spaces between all these other structures. And those cells are important because they are called fibrocytes, and they produce a protein fiber called collagen, one of the most abundant proteins in the human body. Now, the model is actually trying to show you, if we zoom into it, the fiber orientation of the collagen. You can see some lines going this way, some other lines.
آره خیلی زوم نیست ولی میفهمیم که این یه سری چیزا اینجوریه داره میره اینور اونور خب
in between the other spaces going in other directions, and that is why the tissue or the dermis is referred to as a dense irregular connective tissue because the
بافت پیوندی نامنظم متراکم
collagen fibers are going in all directions.
پیوندی نامنظمه و
Which we'll
تو
talk
هم
about
دیگه
the
است.
interaction with ink here soon. But because the collagen is going in all directions, it gives skin its strength to be tugged on in every which way. Or in other words, all directions. Now, the skin is not just made up of, or I should say specifically the dermis, is not just made up of fibrocytes and collagen. As you can see from the skin model, there are a whole bunch of other structures in here. We've got sweat glands, blood vessels coming through here, nerve endings. and even hair follicles that have pushed down from the epidermis. So
خب
again, how does this anatomical knowledge help us understand how tattoos work in this layer? Well, ink is being deposited into the dermal
اون سوزنه، فرض کن اون سوزنی که باش جوهر تتو میره توی بدن، اینجوری
layer,
اینجوری
and a lot of that ink is going to get suspended in that collagen
تتو میاد اینجا، جوهر میاد داخل این لایه.
matrix. And some of it will be even taken up by those fibrocytes or those cells I mentioned earlier. But that's not the only thing that's going on here. You see, during tattooing, a needle is puncturing the skin at anywhere from 50 to 3,000 times per minute. That's creating trauma as well as injecting a foreign substance into the skin. Now, usually when our body deals with trauma or a foreign substance gets introduced, our immune system has something to say about that, and the inflammatory process gets activated. Now, we could do a whole video just
یعنی فرایند التهابی یک فرایند دفاعیه که در برابر یه چیز خارجی اتفاق میفته. خب
on the process of inflammation. But one of the main take-home points for us is that inflammation is getting white blood cells to the site of injury, infection, or to deal with foreign substances. And that's what happens during the tattoo process. White blood cells get called to the area, they'll leave these blood vessels and then go roam through the tissue, which is a really interesting thing because these cells, specifically these white blood cells called macrophages, are these little engulfers. In other words, they engulf or take up foreign substances. That could be viruses, that could be bacteria, dead tissue, and debris. But in this case, they start trying to engulf the ink. Now that engulfment process is a
غرق شدن نمیشه اینگالف. فکر کنم همون بلعیدن درست بود. swallow up همون بلعیدن میشه. دقیقا همون بلعیدنه. غرق اشتباس.
technical term called phagocytosis. And typically once a white blood cell phagocytizes or engulfs something, it starts to break it down and digest it.
دقیقا.
However, it's used to breaking down and digesting biological substances. Ink can include dye, plastics, and even solids that our immune system or our white blood cells are not really equipped to break down very well or digest.
میگه یعنی چیز موادی که داخل جوهر تتو هست، اون سلولای سفید خونی، منظور همون گلبول سفید که میره اونجا، نمیتونه اون رو هضم کنه چون اونا چیزای اون مواد زنده نیست. میدونی چی میگم؟ اون مواد مثلا مثل ویروس و باکتری و اینا که موجودات زندن، خب مثل اونا نیست.
So what's the
پلاستیک و رنگ و یه سری چیزای جامده که اصلا نمیدونه اون باید چیکار بکنه با اون. میخوره قضیه رو، ولی خب موقعی که میخواد هضم بکنه.
You think with some of the research that's leading to this is instead of being able to break it down because they can't, it's more of like let's isolate it and contain it and not let this ink go to other areas of the
دقیقاً قرنطینش میکنه. میگه اینو اینجا نگه میداریم، نمیذاریم جای دیگه بره، دیگه نمیدونیم یه خاکی تو سرمون میکنیم دیگه. حالا اینو اینجا نگه میداریم تا ببینیم خدا چی میخواد.
body. So that's pretty crazy to think about. Those white blood cells getting some of that ink from the collagen, they'll even engulf some of the dead fibrocytes, and that ink stays in them, and you can see that through the surface of the skin. And the idea is that those white blood cells just kind of stay put there. And if you're like me, you're kind of thinking, you know, white blood cells don't last a person's life. So how is that staying there for the majority of this tattoo or for the length of a person's life? Because tattoos are relatively permanent. What they have started to find is that when the macrophages that engulf the ink, when they die, they release the ink. And then guess what happens? A new macrophage comes in and engulfs that ink. So it's almost like this engulf, release, this kind of cyclic process that happens to maintain the tattoo in that area. But remember I mentioned the whole idea, at least the going theory, is we're going to just contain the ink here. And it does obviously a pretty good job because those of you who have tattoos or seen people with tattoos You notice the tattoo doesn't like migrate or move, but you
دقیقاً.
do notice that it sometimes fades with time. So there's a couple of going theories with this. One is that as a macrophage
چه پیرمرده، چه پیرمرده جوابیه این پیرمرد. بذار بدنو ببین جون بابا، پشما، هست خوش.
So there's a couple of going theories with this.
البته تستوسترون تزریق کرده بود، کاملا مشخص بود، ولی خب حالا
One is that as a macrophage dies and releases that ink, the new incoming macrophage engulfs most of the ink. And some of the
آها
smaller broken down ink particles will get taken away into the lymphatic vessels. We
وارد
know
رگ‌های لنفاوی میشن. خب
that some of the ink gets into the lymphatic system because they've done biopsies on distant lymph nodes and found tattoo ink in there. So that is likely contributing to the fading of tattooing over time. Granted, other things like UV light can fade tattoos and break the ink down, but that's one of the ideas of how these are relatively permanent with some changes over time. Now, one other thing I need to address. Some of you may be thinking, Jonathan sure has used the phrase foreign substance multiple times throughout the video. Should I be worried about getting a tattoo or even worried about the tattoo that I already have? And no, not so much. We've used foreign objects or substances in things like surgeries, like knee replacements, or metal rods for like repairing major fractures or for support of those bones, even mesh for things like hernia repairs. Now, that doesn't mean people haven't
برای چی؟
even mesh for things like hernia repairs.
خب
Now, that doesn't mean people haven't had reactions to those substances or even reactions to tattoo ink, but the majority of people do just fine. The most important parts of getting a tattoo are one, going to a reputable tattoo artist that uses precautions to help mitigate risk of infection and reactions, as well as this other important concept when it comes to getting a tattoo, and that is aftercare. And that's why I really love the sponsor of this video called Sanoderm
خب مثل اینکه رسیدیم به بحث اسپانسر.
Medical. They truly
حالا
understand the importance of
حالا
aftercare
بذار
and
نشون
even
بده.
skincare prior to and during the tattooing process. Like I said, I want to say thank you to the sponsor of this video, Sanoderm, for supporting this project. Sanoderm brings you the best.
داداش ببین عادیه، ببین عادیه، طرف 7 میلیون تقریبا سابسکرایبر داره، بعد مثلا الان این تیکش مثلا که داره ضبط میکنه میکروفونش خفه است. داداش technical difficulties میدونی پیش میاد، مشکلات فنی داداش پیش میاد.
Best of the best of skin and wound care products. From sterile, clear, breathable wound bandages to dermal supplements to replenishing lotions and balms and even invigorating soaps, which I'm pretty excited about. Now, while Sanoderm is world-renowned as a dermal authority in the tattoo industry,
مومیایی کننده فکر کنم همون مام بود، جدا میگم
they're bringing that expertise
یه نوع مام بود مثلا.
well beyond the world of
اونی که شبیه چسب، اینو نگاه کن، اینی که شبیه چسب ماتیکی قدیمیا بود، چسب ماتیکی، شبیه چسب ماتیکیه، این چیه؟ همون مامه دیگه.
ink. They are now bringing the medical-grade, uncompromised ingredients to the masses for everyday skincare. Sanoderm focuses on healing and protecting the skin from the inside.
خلاصه آقا بریم.
That takes care of the most important layer when it comes to tattooing, the dermis. However, we mentioned epidermis, dermis, hypodermis or subcutaneous layer, and that hypodermis or subcutaneous layer is still important to some topics with tattooing, specifically a topic known as blowout, or when the tattoo lines start to blur. So let's dive into that. So again, let's go back to our skin dissection here. And here was the dermal edge here, but I'm going to rotate it over. And if you look closely, you can see some yellowy tissue, especially down here on the bottom edge here. And that is the hypodermis. And the hypodermis, again made out of a different tissue than the two above, is made of adipose tissue or fatty tissue.
گفت از اون دوتا دیگه یه چیزی دیگه هست، یعنی متفاوته، گوناگونن با هم دیگه، گوناگونن. خب
Go to the other dissection, you can see it even better. You can see all of that yellowy tissue is the hypodermis and again fatty tissue. Now the nature of this tissue is kind of more of an oily type of a tissue. And if ink gets down into that layer, because of the nature of the oily tissue, it can kind of blur the lines, or it almost looks like it kind of like dissipates into the skin a little bit more. And again, adipose. Think of kind of the interactions between oils, which would be fats, and other liquid substances, and you can kind of get that idea of why it might start to blur the lines here. Now, there's another really important concept to think about as far as why are some areas more at risk for blurring than others, and that is a discussion of skin thickness. And when we're talking about skin thickness, I love to show these two cadaver dissections because this skin dissection and this one right here that I'll bring a little closer in a second are from the same cadaver. Look at the thickness of the dermis here. This is from the mid-back of a cadaver. And then I come to this, and you can see it's just so much more flimsy, and that edge is mostly the dermal tissue from the same person or same cadaver, but this came from the lower leg. Now, I'm not a tattoo artist, but when I've talked to tattoo artists, they talk about the idea of what causes a blurred line or blowout, and that tends to deal with pressure of how much they push on the skin. Now, if you push harder, the idea is some of that ink might get more likely pushed down into the hypodermis, but it's also influenced just on the region. You almost have more give or more room for error in the dermis on the mid-back as opposed to, say, something
میدبک یعنی وسطای پشت کمر. خب
on the lower leg where the dermal
قسمت پایین
tissue
پا،
is
ساق
thinner,
پا.
and so it wouldn't take as much pressure to get the ink down into the hypodermis and potentially cause some of that blurring or blowout. So now we've made it through all three layers of the skin into the hypodermis, but it's also influenced just on the region. You almost have more give or more room for error in the dermis on the mid-back as opposed to, say, something on the lower leg where the dermal tissue is thinner, and so it wouldn't take as much pressure to get the ink down into the hypodermis and potentially cause some of that blurring or blowout.
آها الان فهمیدم چی میگه. ببین میگه اون جایی که پوستش نازکه مثل ساق پا خیلی فشار نمیدی، خب ولی چون نازکه میره تو اون لایه اویلیه، تو اون لایه چرب روغنیه، اونجا چیز میشه، حالت تار میشه و دیگه کم کم از بین میره. اوکی، خیلی مهم بود به نظرم برای کسایی که مثلا میخوان تاتو بزنن. مثلا خیلی چیز مهمی بود.
Made it through all three layers of the skin and gave us this idea about how important the nature of the tissue is in influencing
عجب دندونایی داره حاجی. یهو به دندوناش دقت کردم.
happens with the tattoo ink. We know the epidermis, if any of the ink gets in those cells, flakes off after about 4 weeks. The dermis is where we want all the majority of that ink, the most stable for permanence and nice crisp artwork. And we now know the hypodermis, more at risk for bleeding out or blurring or that blowout because of the nature of the adipose and that oily tissue underneath. Thanks for watching the video, everyone.
خب دیگه مرسی. آره خلاصه قضیه این بود که پوست تا لایه بود. لایه اولیه که هیچی، پشم خیلی نازک که اصلا اتفاق خاصی تو اون لایه نمیفته. بذار من چیز کنم. اوکی، خیلی اتفاق خاصی توش نمیفته اون لایه، اون هیچی. لایه دومی که لایه مهمتری بود، اون لایه بود که بیشتر تاتو داخل اون میموند. بعد گلبولای سفید اون تاتو رو تو خودشون نگه می‌داشتن و خلاصه بعد هی میمردن، هی بعدی میومد میگفت داداش بگیر، تو رو خدا تاتو رو بگیر، داداش یارو 10 میلیون پول داده تاتو رو بگیر. آره دیگه، بعد اینا رو نگه که میدارن دیگه میمونه تاتو اونجا. بعد اگه خیلی بره اون پایین‌تر فید میشه، اینجوری از بین میره، تار میشه. تو لایه دومی هم چی میشه که از بین میره دیگه؟ با گذر زمان، با گذر فاکین زمان. خلاصه داداش این چنل Institute of Human Anatomy What Tattoos Do to the Skin. اگه دوست داشتین like and subscribe the content. بعد در کل حالا اینو واقعا بگم که من گفت معمولا براتون مشکلی به وجود نمیاره، چیز خیلی خاصی نیست و من خودم شخصا فکر میکردم که یعنی من نظرم منفی بود، ولی خب به نظرم خیلی خوب توضیح داد. اتفاق خاصی از لحاظ پزشکی براتون نمیفته و خیلی هم خوب دوستانی که دوست دارن تتو بزنن، داداش سیفه، بزن، اوکیه، بزن، اصلا نگران نباش. مثل اینکه برای اکثر افراد هیچ مشکلی وجود نمیاد، فقط باید یه سری مراقبت‌های پوستی بعدش بکنی که حالا دیگه اونا دیگه بستگی به جیبت داره، میدونید جیب، چون احتمال همه پولتو دادی برای تتو، حالا دیگه خلاصه خود دانی، میدونی. آره دیگه، اینم از این. بریم، تا خدا هست مشکلی نیست، هر کس از سلام، چشم به همه‌زاری هاشمی نیست و شاپ خیا اومورت دیگه، میبینمتون.